The Edict of Ashes. The War Edict arrived on a Tuesday. Not that Tuesday meant anything to the Vorkai Dominion. Their concept of time was measured in stellar cycles and the slow grinding of tectonic plates, but the irony was not lost on Commander Zale Orvin of the Earth Sovereignty Fleet. Humanity had been notified of its own extinction on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning, by a perfectly ordinary automated diplomatic courier, somewhere between the breakfast rush at Callisto Station and the third cup of coffee on the bridge of the ESF Relentless Will. Zale read the transmission twice, then a third time. Then he set it down on the holographic table and stared at it like a man watching a fuse burn toward something enormous. The Vorkai Dominion, rulers of 9 star systems and architects of the Concordat of Silence that had kept galactic peace for 300 years, had formally declared war on humanity. All 4 billion of them. Every colony, every station, every drifting settlement from the Kuiper Fringe to the reach of Andar. The edict was thorough, beautifully worded, and completely serious. Reason given: humanity had violated Vorkai territorial sovereignty by establishing the mining colony of Verithas landing on the moon Duros 7. A moon that, according to Vorkai cartography, had been designated a sacred site of the Forgotten Chorus approximately 4,000 years before humans had developed agriculture. Zale rubbed his jaw. "Get me Counselor Marin Vex," he said to nobody in particular. His aide, a sharp-faced young lieutenant named Tovin Shade, was already moving. "She's on the line, Commander." "She's been on the line for 11 minutes. I think she's been waiting for you to finish reading." Marin Vex, chief diplomatic counselor of the Earth Sovereignty Council, appeared on the bridge screen with the composed expression of a woman who had spent 30 years eating bad news for breakfast and asking for seconds. She had silver hair cropped close to her skull, warm brown skin mapped with the faint lines of old stress, and eyes the color of storm clouds. "You've read it," she said. Was not a question. "I've read it," Zale confirmed. "They're serious. The Vorkai are always serious. It's one of their least endearing qualities." She pressed her fingertips together. "The Galactic Consortium has already reached out. 7 species, all urging us to submit immediately. Issue an apology, abandon the colony, pay reparations. And if we don't? The Vorkai fleet moves in 36 standard hours. Their forward battle group alone outnumbers our entire Reach garrison 4-1. And Commander," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "not a single member species of the consortium believes we'll survive this." Zale nodded slowly. He turned away from the screen and looked out through the observation port at the star field beyond, cold, indifferent, impossibly vast. He had spent his entire career among those stars. He knew what was out there. He also knew what was in here, in the corridors and engine rooms and mess halls of human ships, in the minds and hands and stubborn, maddening hearts of human beings. 36 hours, he said quietly. "Yes. Then we'd better get busy." The Vorkai Dominion had made their calculations carefully. They were a methodical people, tall, gray-skinned, with multiple eyes arranged in a crown around their wide skulls, and a culture built on precision, hierarchy, and an unshakable belief in the supremacy of established order. They had conquered their 9 systems not through savagery but through absolute, overwhelming force multiplied by perfect tactical patience. They did not make mistakes. They did not leave variables unaccounted for. What they had not accounted for was High Admiral Sora Den. She was 49 years old, born in the underground cities of Mars, raised on stories of how her grandmother had helped seal the hull of Olympus Station with nothing but a spacesuit patch and a prayer during the Great Decompression event of 2187. She had fought in 3 border skirmishes, designed 2 fleet doctrines that were now considered mandatory reading at every major military academy in human space, and was known throughout the ESF for 2 things: her absolute fearlessness, and her absolute refusal to fight any battle the way her enemy expected her to. She stood in the war room on Callisto Station, surrounded by a constellation of holographic maps, fleet positions, resource inventories and tactical projections, and she smiled the smile of a woman who had just been handed a puzzle she found genuinely interesting. "Pull up everything we know about the Vorkai fleet doctrine," she said, "and get me Professor Leary's tan. I want a xenopsychologist in this room in the next 2 hours." Her adjutant, Major Breck Halverson, a broad-shouldered man from New Oslo on Europa with kind eyes and a talent for organized chaos, looked at her with the expression of someone who was already 3 steps behind and had accepted this as his permanent condition. "Professor Tan is on sabbatical in the Outer Reach, Admiral. She's studying the migration patterns of something called a void whale." Then interrupt her. "Tell her the void whales will have to wait. Humanity's having an extinction event." Breck blinked. "Right. Oh. Phrase it exactly like that. The next 12 hours on Callisto Station were unlike anything in its long institutional memory. Every corridor hummed. Every terminal blazed. People ate at their stations, slept in shifts, ran calculations and reran them when the answers were too scary and then ran them again when they realized the scary answers were probably the right ones. 3 junior analysts independently developed what turned out to be the same flanking strategy, and when they were brought together to compare notes, they spent 40 minutes arguing about who had thought of it first before Breck Halverson politely suggested they direct that energy at refining the strategy instead. The Vorkai battle group crossed the outer marker at hour 34, 2 hours ahead of schedule. The captain of the lead Vorkai dreadnought, a decorated tactician named Preth Valen, studied his sensors with practiced calm. He had expected to find a handful of human ships scrambling into defensive formation, making the kinds of desperate last-minute decisions that characterize species who had never faced real war. Instead he found nothing. The space around Duros 7 was empty. No fleet. No station defense grid. Not even the mining colony, it had been evacuated. All he found was a single human ship, sitting alone in the dark, broadcasting on all frequencies. Press studied it. A courier vessel. Unarmed. Broadcasting a message. Against his better instincts, because in his experience when prey disappeared, that was when you needed to think hardest, he opened the channel. Marin Vex appeared on his screen. She was calm. She was smiling. And she said 6 words that would be analyzed by military historians for the next 200 years. We thought you should know first. The first lesson. The Vorkai War doctrine was a thing of cold beauty. For 3 centuries, it had operated on a principle so effective it had become something close to physics. Identify the enemy's center of gravity, apply overwhelming force to it, and accept surrender within the first engagement. The Dominion had never needed a second battle. Other species, upon seeing the sheer scale of Vorkai military architecture, their kilometer-long dreadnoughts, their planet-scorching rail arrays, their fighter screens that moved in absolute coordinated silence, made rational calculations and yielded. It was, the Vorkai believed, the most merciful form of warfare. Efficient. Over quickly. What Admiral Sora Den had sent back through Counselor Marin Vex's message was not a white flag. It was a lesson plan. The 6 words, "We thought you should know first," were the opening of a 40-minute transmission detailing exactly what humanity had done in the 36 hours since receiving the war edict. Every shipyard in human space had been placed on emergency production. Every civilian transport above a certain tonnage had been requisitioned and was being fitted with weapon mounts. Every reserve unit had been activated. Every automated defense platform at every colony had been switched from standby to combat mode. Every research team working on anything with even theoretical military applications had been redirected, given unlimited resources, and told to make something useful in the next 2 weeks. But more than that, and this was the part that made Preth Valen go very still at his command station, humanity had not concentrated its forces. It had scattered them. There was no center of gravity. The ESF had dispersed across 43 separate vectors, in groups ranging from full battle groups to single-ship scout units, all of them moving, all of them changing course on unpredictable schedules, all of them operating under a distributed command protocol that made it impossible to identify a single decision-making hub and destroy it. Humanity had essentially turned itself into a cloud. You could not hit a cloud with a hammer. You could only wade into it and discover, one sting at a time, what it was made of. "They're insane," said Preth's tactical officer, Sivith, with something that in a Vorkai would have been the closest approximation to awe. "Their logistics alone should be impossible. How are they coordinating without a central command?" "Distributed networks," said the Dominion's intelligence analyst, a careful young officer named Oris, consulting her data with growing unease. "They've had experience with this. In their early history, several centuries ago, they had conflicts where hierarchical command structures were deliberately targeted and destroyed. They developed methods of maintaining cohesion without centralization. It appears those methods were never decommissioned. They were simply filed away." Preth studied the holographic display. 43 vectors. Unknown total force composition. No obvious vulnerabilities. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a human admiral who had just told him, politely, directly, with the calm of someone who had thought this through, that she knew his doctrine, she had planned for his doctrine, and she had specifically arranged the battlefield so that his doctrine would not work. He sent a message back to the Dominion High Command. It said, in the formal Vorkai diplomatic register, "The engagement parameters are atypical. Request additional strategic guidance." which was the closest a Vorkai fleet commander had ever come to saying, "I am not sure what I am dealing with." High Admiral Den received the intelligence report about that message 9 hours later, via a network of sensor drones she had seeded across the outer system, and she laughed for the first time in 3 days. Not unkindly. Just with the satisfaction of someone whose first hypothesis had been confirmed. "They're reassessing," she told Breck Halverson. "Good. That gives us time." Time for what? For the consortium species to see what we're doing and start asking questions. Because right now, Admiral, every xenobiologist and military analyst across 12 civilizations is watching a species that was given a death sentence sit down at the chessboard and ask for white. The battle that historians would later call the engagement of the Hollow Wing happened on Day 9. A Vorkai fast strike squadron, 12 ships, sleek and merciless, identified what appeared to be a human supply convoy moving through the Andar corridor. Fat targets. Slow-moving. Lightly defended. By every model in Vorkai tactical doctrine, a perfect opportunity. The convoy was not a convoy. It was 12 converted freighters, each one loaded with sensor reflectors and drive signature emitters calibrated to look exactly like military supply vessels on long-range scan. The actual cargo was something far more creative, an autonomous minefield of the type the ESF called Widow's Garden, designed by a 28-year-old engineer from the asteroid settlements named Kala Reach who had spent the previous 6 days working on approximately 3 hours of sleep per night and who, upon being told her design had been approved, had simply said good and gone back to work on the next version. The Vorkai squadron entered the corridor at attack velocity and ran directly into 17,000 self-targeting proximity charges that had been programmed to behave exactly like empty space until they had something worth detonating for. 6 ships were destroyed outright. 4 were disabled. 2 escaped, reporting contact with an enemy force they could not characterize because there had been no ships at all, just the sudden, catastrophic realization that the ground was not what they'd thought it was. Across the consortium, the reports spread like quiet fire. The Vorkai Fast Strike Squadron, 12 of the finest ships in the Dominion fleet, had been reduced by 15 minutes of contact with cargo vessels that weren't cargo vessels, in a corridor that wasn't a corridor, in an engagement that didn't follow any known template. In the Theron Collective's diplomatic chambers, the senior analyst Mortisfun, a being of calm, methodical judgment who had accurately predicted the outcome of 63 interstellar conflicts, looked at the preliminary data and said something she had not said in 40 years of professional service. "I don't know how this ends." Her junior colleague, a young analyst named VS, looked up from his terminal with wide eyes. "You've never said that before. I've never seen this before." She turned back to the data. "Run the projections again. And this time, add a variable for human willingness to do things that should not be possible." VS paused. "How do I quantify that?" Mortisfun was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know yet. Start with extremely high, and see if the models break." They did. Weight of the forgotten. By the 3rd week of the war, the Vorkai Dominion had committed fully. Preth Valen's initial hesitation had been noted by High Command, and a second fleet element had been deployed, 41 ships under Supreme Executor Vareth, the Dominion's most decorated living strategist, a being who had won 6 campaigns and who operated with the kind of absolute cold certainty that made his own officers uncomfortable in the best possible way. Vareth did not reassess. Vareth identified, decided, and acted. It was what he had always done and it had never once failed him. He arrived in human space like a geological event. And then he stopped. Not from hesitation. Vareth never hesitated. He stopped because the spatial intelligence data he was receiving from forward probes was telling him things that his tactical models rated as probability anomalies, occurrences too unlikely to incorporate, events that should have been impossible and yet kept appearing in the sensor logs with the cheerful regularity of things that were simply happening regardless of what the models thought. The ESF Relentless Will, Commander Zale Orvan's ship, had appeared in 3 separate locations simultaneously, confirmed by multiple sensor arrays. This was physically impossible. Zale had achieved it with a technique that would eventually be called the Echo Protocol, a combination of drive signature spoofing, coordinated sensor drone deployment, and an absolutely unreasonable amount of creative thinking from his tactical team, led by a navigator named Devi Osk who had grown up playing strategy games competitively and who approached military logistics the way other people approached puzzles, with total focus, zero ego, and an almost aggressive delight in finding solutions that technically worked even if they violated the spirit of what the rulebook had been trying to achieve. "I want to be clear," Devi had told Zale, 3 days before the Echo Protocol's first deployment, That this will confuse our own sensor teams too if they're in the area. That's fine, Zale had said. It might also confuse our allied traffic. We don't have allied traffic. Devi had nodded slowly. Right. Okay. We're alone in a war against a superior force and I'm going to make us appear to be 3 places at once. That's fine. That's completely fine. I'll go build that now. She had. And it had worked. And Supreme Executor Vareth was now staring at sensor data that told him the ESF Relentless was simultaneously near the 4th moon of Andar Prime, somewhere in the deep field behind his fleet's left flank, and approaching from a vector that would, if the ship were real, require it to have been traveling at 1.3 times the speed he believed humans were capable of. More disturbing was what was happening at Kareth Station. Kareth was a Vorkai resupply hub, established in the system before the war and considered well behind the front lines. It had a modest defensive complement because nothing was supposed to reach it. The Dominion had mapped the approach corridors carefully. There were 3 viable entry vectors, all of them monitored, all of them seeded with early warning systems that would give the station hours of warning if anything moved toward it at combat velocity. Lieutenant Commander Priya Moss had not approached at combat velocity. She had approached at the speed of debris. The ESF heavy corvette Quiet Argument had decelerated 8 days before reaching the system and drifted in along a trajectory that matched the natural drift of post-impact rocky debris that the system's data records showed had been floating through this region of space for approximately 600 years. The ship had been running cold, minimal power, no active systems, crew in rotating hibernation shifts of 4 hours each, life support at absolute minimum. It had taken 11 days. Priya had eaten freeze-dried meals the entire time and had used the hibernation cycles to read every tactical manual she could access and to handwrite, on actual paper because she liked paper, a 60-page assessment of Vorkai defensive psychology that she fully intended to submit to the intelligence division if she survived. The Quiet Argument had arrived at Kareth Station running cold, drifting at debris velocity, indistinguishable from the local spatial environment, and then it had come to life. In the 14 minutes before Karetha's defenders could mount a coherent response, Priya Moss had destroyed the station's fuel depot, disabled its communication array, collapsed the docking bay magnetic fields to prevent resupply, and departed along the one vector that the Vorkai models had rated as impassable because it required threading the ship through a debris field at a clearance of less than 40 meters for a distance of 1,200 kilometers. She had made it. She had lost some paint and a secondary sensor array. The station had been effectively neutralized for 6 weeks. Priya's after-action report, submitted 48 hours later, included the 60-page psychological assessment, 2 technical recommendations for improving the cold drift approach profile, and a note at the bottom that read, "Recommend improved freeze-dried meal variety. The current selection is adequate but morale benefits from at least one enjoyable option." Supreme Executor Vareth read the intelligence summary about Kareth Station and sat in silence for a very long time. "How did they get past the early warning systems?" he asked finally. "They didn't, Executor. They avoided them by moving below the threshold that triggers a detection event. They moved at the speed of inanimate matter and trusted that our systems would classify them as inanimate matter." Vareth was quiet again. "Then, they hid in plain sight by becoming something we weren't looking for." "Yes, Executor. That is..." He paused. He was a being who chose words with the precision of a sculptor. "That is a thing that requires a very specific kind of mind. A mind that does not assume the rules of engagement will be followed. A mind that begins from the position that nothing is fixed. That appears to be the case." He turned to face his strategy table. "Pull all intelligence on human history. All of it. I want to understand how a species develops this capacity. What made them this way." What he received over the next 12 hours was a history that read less like a civilization's biography and more like a catalog of improbable survivals. A species that had spent 10,000 years struggling against their own planet's indifference, their own internal conflicts, and their own repeated capacity for civilizational collapse and reconstruction. A species that had developed adaptive trauma into something that functioned, in the right circumstances, almost like a superpower, because if you had survived long enough to be alive and still fighting, you had already demonstrated that your models for what was possible were not your only resource. Your will was also a resource. Your creativity was a resource. Your absolute refusal to acknowledge that you were supposed to stop was, in certain crucial moments, the most important resource of all. Vareth read it. He read all of it. He had requested the full history because he was a thorough strategist. He finished reading at 0300 station time, and he sent an encrypted message to the Dominion High Council that said 3 things. 1. This war would not end in 36 hours. 2. The humans had known it would not end in 36 hours. 3. He was not certain he knew what winning looked like anymore, and he suspected the humans did. What they carry. The Galactic Consortium had been watching. This was their nature. The Consortium was not a government. It had no military of its own, no ability to enforce its resolutions, no mechanism for doing anything except observing, deliberating, and issuing recommendations that the great powers might or might not follow depending on their mood and their circumstances. What it was very good at was watching, recording, and in the long sweep of centuries, shaping the way civilizations understood their own history. Analyst Morty Sven had not left her station in 9 days. She had, during that time, submitted 7 preliminary reports that had been revised as events overtook them, consumed a quantity of processed nutrition that she was choosing not to think about, and developed what she believed to be the most complete picture of the current conflict in existence outside the participating species themselves. She had also, in quiet moments, begun to experience something she recognized as a species of concern that was not purely professional. The Vorkai were not losing. Not yet. Their fleet was still larger, their firepower still overwhelming, their industrial capacity still dwarfed anything humanity could produce. What was happening was something more unsettling than losing. They were failing to win. Every tactical operation that should have been decisive had either been evaded, absorbed, or turned back in ways that were individually explicable and collectively inexplicable, because the pattern they formed, the persistent, grinding, creative, relentless pattern, suggested something that Vorkai doctrine had no category for. The Vorkai had never fought a species that got better at being threatened. That was what Mortis kept returning to in her quieter moments, staring at the trajectory analysis and the resource allocation data and the after-action reports that kept coming through. Every time the Dominion found a vulnerability and struck it, the humans reconfigured to close that vulnerability. Every time a tactic worked, the next time it was tried it worked less well. Every time something hurt them, and things were hurting them, she was clear-eyed about that. The casualty reports from the ESF were real. They incorporated that information into what they were doing with a speed that was genuinely alarming. It was as if, she wrote in her private journal, they had evolved specifically to thrive under the selective pressure of warfare. Not to win any individual battle, but to become, over time, harder to kill than they had been before the battle started. The Theron Collective formally requested observer status with the ESF on day 22. The Vorkai protested. The collective pointed out that observer status was a consortium convention the Vorkai themselves had lobbied for and achieved during 2 previous conflicts and could not therefore object to on principle. The Vorkai, who were many things but not hypocrites, subsided. The collective's observer, a being named Sus Orith, arrived at Callisto Station on day 24. She was a small, meticulous person with 3-jointed fingers and a manner of paying attention that made every human in the room feel they were being studied by something very old and very patient. She had brought 12 data recorders, 5 research assistants, and no preconceptions she had not already identified and set aside. Admiral Den met her in the war room. "I was told you wanted to observe," Den said. "I want to understand," Sus Orith corrected gently. "There is a difference. Observation is passive. Understanding requires engagement. I hope you'll permit me to ask questions. I'll answer what I can. Then let me begin with this." The Theron analyst's eyes, compound, multifaceted, capable of seeing into ranges that humans couldn't, focused on Den with an attention that was almost tangible. "The consortium has modeled this conflict 14 times using our most advanced predictive frameworks. Every model assigns the Vorkai a probability of victory above 90% within a 90-day window. And yet, 24 days in, we are seeing results that the models do not account for. I want to understand what the models are missing." Den was quiet for a moment. Then she walked to the observation window and looked out at the stars. "The models are probably missing what we know about ourselves," she said finally. "Which is that we've been in impossible situations before. A lot of them. And the thing about being in an impossible situation repeatedly is that you stop believing it's impossible. You start asking, okay, which part of this can I change? Not all of it. Maybe not most of it. But which part?" She turned back. "That's not courage. It's not stubbornness. It's a habit of mind that we've built over a very long time of surviving things we shouldn't have." Sus Orith recorded this carefully. "And you believe this habit of mind is decisive?" "I believe it's the reason we're still having this conversation. The Vorkai are trying to find a target. We've made ourselves into something you can't target without fighting all of it, all at once, on terrain we've chosen, in conditions we've prepared for." Den smiled, and there was something in it that was not entirely comfortable. And we've been preparing for this longer than anyone knew. On day 26, three things happened in rapid succession. First, the ESF Relentless Will, using the Echo Protocol and a new variant Devi OSK had developed and called the Cascade, appeared to an advancing Vorkai battle group to be an entire task force of 7 vessels approaching from a prepared defensive position. The battle group, acting on doctrine, deployed to engage the task force and found itself in an asteroid field it had not mapped because the ESF had accelerated several large rocky bodies into new trajectories over the preceding 19 days, deliberately creating a field that hadn't existed when the Vorkai had last surveyed the area. They lost 2 ships to collision events before extracting. Second, the crew of the disabled Vorkai ship Enduring Calculation, one of the 4 disabled vessels from the Hollow Wing engagement, was delivered, alive and unharmed, to neutral consortium space aboard an ESF medical transport. They were accompanied by a formal message from Commander Zale Orvin stating that in ESF military tradition, enemies who could not continue fighting were not enemies anymore, and would be treated accordingly. The message was carefully neutral in tone and asked for nothing in return. It was translated into 17 languages by the Consortium Diplomatic Division and distributed to every member species within 6 hours. Third, Lieutenant Commander Priya Moss submitted her 60-page psychological assessment to ESF Intelligence. The Intelligence Division read it and immediately classified it at the highest possible level, then reconsidered and declassified it and sent it to every fleet commander in human space, because the insight it contained about Vorkai decision-making patterns was too useful to keep locked away. Supreme Executor Vareth received intelligence about the first 2 events and sat in the particular kind of silence that was not emptiness but fullness, the silence of a being processing something that was genuinely changing the way it understood its situation. The humans had reshaped the physical environment of the battlefield over 19 days without triggering any surveillance alerts. They had defeated a battle group without a battle. And they had returned his people who had been, by all rights, legitimate prisoners of war, with no conditions and no statement of advantage. They're not trying to defeat us, he said to Sivith slowly. They're trying to make defeat irrelevant. Sivith was quiet for a moment. Executor? They're removing every position from which we can apply our strengths. They will not give us a decisive engagement. They will not give us a center of gravity. They will not give us a moment of clear superiority, and they will not give us a reason to feel contempt. He paused. And they returned our crew because they want us to know that this is not about hatred. This is about something else. About what? Vareth looked out at the stars. I'm beginning to think it's about teaching us something. The reckoning at Andar. On day 31, Supreme Executor Vareth made a decision that violated every principle in Vorkai military doctrine. He requested a conversation. Not a negotiation. Not a formal diplomatic channel. A conversation, a word that had no military standing in any protocol either civilization had developed, and which he had chosen deliberately because it carried no assumptions about outcome, no preconditions about power, and no implication that one party had already won. He sent the request to the ESF communications relay at the edge of the Andar system, addressed directly to High Admiral Sora Den. The message read in full, I have read your history. I would speak with you. Not as enemies. As individuals who are trying to understand something. If this request is refused, I will understand why. Den received it at 0647, sitting in the war room with a cold cup of coffee and Breck Halverson's latest logistics summary spread across 3 screens. She read it twice. Then she put the coffee down and said, Get Counselor Vex. The conversation happened via secure relay 40 hours later, with both parties in undisclosed locations and with full recording transparency. Both sides had agreed that whatever was said would be preserved in its entirety, with no editing for the record. It lasted 4 hours and 12 minutes. Vareth began by asking a question that Den had not expected. When you were given 36 hours, what did you feel? She considered it honestly. Anger. Then very briefly, fear. Then something I can only describe as focus. The problem became very clear. We knew what we needed to do. Even knowing the probability of your survival was very low? Especially then. Low probability means you have nothing to lose by trying everything. She paused. What did you expect us to do? Yield? Vareth said simply. Every species we have confronted in this way has yielded. Not from cowardice. From rational calculation. Yielding was the logical response to the situation. It probably was. And yet. Den was quiet for a moment. Executor, can I ask what changed your thinking? Not your strategy. Your thinking. Vareth was quiet for longer than she had expected. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of a being saying something out loud for the first time. You returned our crew. You had no reason to. It gained you nothing tactically. It complicated your logistics. And you did it because, he paused again, because that is what you do. Not for advantage. Because it is the kind of species you are. And I realized that I had been fighting a species I had not yet understood. Marin Vex, listening from an adjacent room, made a note. The negotiations that followed were not simple. Nothing about them was simple. The Vorkai had 600 years of legal precedent to navigate. Humanity had 4 billion people who had spent the last month in varying degrees of mobilized terror and would need to understand why the war was ending before it had reached its conclusion. The consortium had 7 species who had been absolutely certain of the outcome and who would need to reconcile that certainty with what had actually happened. But the shape of the resolution, when it finally came, was something that surprised everyone who had been modeling the conflict. The mining colony at Duros 7 would be relocated. Humanity had already agreed to this in principle, and Den had made clear from the beginning that the colony itself was not worth a war. The Vorkai would formally acknowledge that the Edict of War had been issued without adequate diplomatic process, a concession that cost them prestige but that Vareth had argued internally was accurate and therefore should be made. A joint cultural commission would be established to map disputed sacred sites across the contested region before any further human expansion occurred there. And the Dominion and the Earth Sovereignty Council would enter into a formal communication treaty, not an alliance, not yet, but an agreement to keep talking. The last point had been Vareth's suggestion. Den had accepted it immediately. The formal end of hostilities declaration was signed on day 47. The ceremony was brief, practical, and attended by representatives of every consortium species, all of whom were there partly for the diplomatic significance and partly because they wanted to look at the humans with their own eyes. Sus Orth filed her final observer report 3 days later. It was the longest report the Theron Collective had received from a field observer in 200 years. Its conclusion read in part, "The conflict between the Vorkai Dominion and the human Earth Sovereignty Fleet is significant not for its outcome, which was, in the end, a negotiated settlement of the kind conflicts often produce, but for what it revealed about human adaptive capacity. 47 days ago, every predictive model in the consortium assigned humanity less than a 12% probability of surviving this conflict as a functioning civilization. The humans were aware of these assessments. They were aware that the consensus of galactic opinion was that they should yield. They chose not to, and they did not do so from ignorance or from irrationality, but from a quality that our models had categorized as stubbornness and that I now believe deserves a more precise name. The humans call it various things: resilience, determination, will. What I observed was something more specific. A species-level refusal to allow any external assessment of their probability of survival to become the ceiling of what they attempted. They did not beat the odds. They chose to stop treating the odds as the most important information available to them. I do not know of another species in the consortium's recorded history who has demonstrated this capacity at scale. I strongly recommend that the consortium revise its modeling frameworks accordingly. The report was read by every senior diplomat and military analyst in the consortium within 2 weeks. It was assigned to required reading lists at 7 major xenopolitical institutes. It was debated, disputed, praised, and criticized in the literature for the next 30 years. Priya Moss received her promotion to full commander on day 50. She was in the middle of writing the 3rd version of her Vorkai psychological assessment, updated with observations from the negotiation period, when the notification arrived. She read it, set it aside, and kept writing. When Breck Halverson came to find her to pass on the Admiral's personal congratulations, she was already 2 pages into a subsection on Vorkai decision-making under uncertainty. "The Admiral wants to know if you have any requests," Breck said, leaning in the doorway. Priya didn't look up from her writing. "Better freeze-dried meals. I've been asking for months." He laughed. He went and told the Admiral. The Admiral, for the first time in 7 weeks, laughed too. Devi Osk was awarded the ESF Medal for Tactical Innovation, the youngest recipient in the award's history. At the ceremony, she was asked what had been her most important resource during the campaign. She thought about it with the same focused attention she gave to every problem. "Paper," she said. "I like to draw diagrams on paper. You can cross things out and try again really easily." She paused. "And good sleep when you can get it? Though we didn't really get a lot of that." Commander Zale Orvin took the Relentless Will back to its normal patrol route in the Outer Reach, where it had been assigned before any of this started. He stood at the observation port on the first quiet night since the war had ended and looked at the stars for a long time. He thought about the 36 hours. He thought about what it had felt like to read the edict and then put it down and begin to think about what was possible. He thought about the Vorkai crew they had returned to neutral space, and the expression of the Vorkai ship captain who had met them at the transfer point, that specific, precise quality of attention that said, "I am looking at something I did not expect to see." He thought about Devi Osk drawing diagrams on paper and Priya Moss drifting cold through a debris field for 11 days and Marin Vex on that screen, composed and clear-eyed, in the first minutes after the world had been told it was ending. He thought about Sora Den, who was probably right now in some planning room somewhere already thinking about the next thing because that was what she did, and what she did was deeply, irreducibly human. She looked at what was in front of her, no matter what it was, and she started working. Somewhere across the galaxy, in the deep chambers of the Vorkai Dominion's High Council, a debate was beginning. It was a quiet debate, careful and slow and conducted in the formal registers of a civilization that did not rush its deliberations. But its subject was a question that had not been asked in the Dominion's 600-year history. What do you do when you declare war on the most dangerous species in the galaxy and discover, only after, that the most dangerous thing about them is not their weapons or their tactics or their creative use of debris fields and cold drift approaches? What do you do when you discover that the most dangerous thing about them is that they will not stop, and they will not hate you, and they will return your crew and ask for nothing, and look at you across 37 days of war with the clear eyes of people who had already decided what kind of species they wanted to be, regardless of outcome? Supreme Executor Vareth, now retired from active command and serving on the Council's Strategic Review Board, was asked his opinion. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to become meaningful. Then he said, "You learn from them. Before it is too late and while they are still willing to teach." In the end, that was what they did.